Hello and welcome to the M.B.M podcast, where you'll learn to master the business of yoga. M.B.M is a proud part of the Wander Barn podcast network, and I'm your host, Amanda Kingsmith. I'm a 500-hour registered yoga teacher, a yoga business coach, and a total business geek. Here at M.B.M, you'll learn everything you need to know to create a sustainable yoga business by learning from myself and guests from around the world about how they built their yoga businesses, and about how you too can become a successful yoga teacher, studio owner, and much more. All right, let's dive in. Hey friends, I just wanted to pop in and talk a little bit about M.B.M Behind the Scenes. When I entered the yoga world as a teacher, I was surprised by how many yoga teachers were struggling with the business side of yoga. And that's why I created M.B.M. M.B.M helps yoga teachers and studio owners become entrepreneurs. It helps you to go from surviving to thriving with your yoga business. I am on a mission to change the yoga industry, to teach yoga teachers and studio owners about the business of yoga, and to help you feel more confident, successful, and abundant. After releasing hundreds of podcast episodes, I want to create content that dives deeper into helping yoga entrepreneurs thrive and elevate their businesses. This is where M.B.M Behind the Scenes comes in. Each week, you will get bonus content from the weekly guest or myself, diving deeper into how you can take the teachings and apply them to your business. This podcast is designed for yoga teachers and studio owners who are ready to take it to the next level. If you enjoy M.B.M and have been looking for an affordable way to learn more, this is it. For the cost of 2 lattes per month, you will get never-before-heard content that you can't access anywhere else that will give you tangible ways to dive deeper into your yoga business. If this sounds like something you're interested in, let's dive in. Head on over to patreon.com/MBM yoga and sign up to get behind the scenes now. Once again, that's patreon.com/MBOM yoga to get all the exclusive behind the scenes content. I'll see you there. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the M.B.M podcast. I am super excited that you are joining me for today's episode of the show. This episode is brought to you by OfferingTree, an all-in-one, easy-to-use online business platform that I've been working with for years. If you're looking to save time, energy, and money, check out OfferingTree. Don't forget to grab your special discount at offeringtree.com/MBM. And stay tuned for later in the episode when I'll tell you a little bit more about the benefits that OfferingTree can offer you and your business. This week on the podcast, I am super excited to be rejoined by Danu. Nyk came on the podcast a number of months ago and talked all about websites. For those of you who aren't familiar with Nyk or her work, she is a yoga business consultant, a yin yoga trainer, and a yoga therapist. And we are diving into the business of yoga therapy on this episode of the show. So we start by catching up with Nyk with everything that she's been up to over the last couple of months. And then we also talk about why she decided to become a yoga therapist, what the difference between being a yoga teacher and yoga therapist is, how a yoga therapy business can differ from a yoga teacher business, and how Nyk has decided to set up her yoga therapy business, among so many other awesome things. So I hope that you enjoy this episode of the show. And without further ado, here is Nyk. Welcome back to the podcast today, Nyk. I'm really excited to have you here with me.
I'm super stoked to be here. I love chatting with you.
Yeah, you too. And I want to start by just kind of catching listeners up about what you've been up to since we chatted last. And we actually chatted in the spring of 2020. So not that long ago, just a couple of months ago. It feels kind of like an eternity and also like no time has passed. So I'm curious, just tell us what you've been up to over the last few months.
I agree. It does feel that way, doesn't it? It's like been one long month. Well, I've been transitioning, trying to, like everybody else has, I guess, to try to get my business online as opposed to it being so dependent on being in person, which is something I actually always intended on doing. I was one of those rare teachers who wanted to start offering Zoom classes like long before COVID hit. I just hadn't quite gotten to it yet. I was actually going to start them in June, and then COVID hit, and I was like, or right now works too. So this was always going to be part of my business model, but I've definitely had to jumpstart and just kind of jump before I'm ready. And so that's been kind of my focus as far as my business goes, is just trying to get it almost feels like it's almost, other than the fact that thankfully I have an email list, it almost feels like a brand new business when you move from all of your teaching being in person to like, for a while there, all of it being online. Now I am able to go and teach in a few locations, with our guidelines, which of course the guidelines are different everywhere and they could change by the time this airs. But currently with the guidelines, we're able to wear masks to our mat. The masks are very well spaced out, and then we can take them off when we practice, put them back on as soon as we leave the mat. And there's lots of, people coming in one door, going out the other door, and sterilizing in between. And so there's certainly, a lot of effort put into the classes. But yeah, I have a couple live classes, but I went from essentially 7, live in-person classes and 0 online to having, I'm trying to think how many I have now, 6 online, and like probably at the end of the month, there'll be 3 in person. So big shift.
Yeah, that's a big pivot in your business. And have you been mostly running like your own online classes or teaching for other studios, or what does that aspect look like?
In the beginning, I was teaching through one of the studios that I was teaching at. But the classes, the Zoom classes with that community just didn't take off the way they did in some other communities. And so it became pretty apparent pretty quick that she was going to be chopping classes. And so I stopped teaching Zoom classes through that studio. And then the same thing with another studio I was teaching at. Unfortunately, she waited quite a while to get them going. And I think we kind of lost the momentum of people. Like I think what some of the studios that allowed this big space in between shutting down and then starting their stuff online ended up either losing some of their students to other online classes, or people just get out of the habit of practicing. And then it's harder for them to come back. So there was a couple places that I taught for in person where that was the case. So by about, I think it was May, I was doing all of them on my own, all my Zoom classes on my own. Now, again, the only reason I was able to do that, though, is because I had an email list already, and I'm originally from Calgary and had moved to Victoria. So I had, students in Calgary that were still hadn't found a teacher and were always like, oh, I wish I could still practice with you. So it kind of, it worked out well for me to be able to just say, hey, how about we try this Zoom thing? I am now running 2, because I much prefer registered semesters versus drop-in classes for a gazillion reasons. And so all of mine are registered semesters. I started small at the beginning with COVID because I honestly didn't know, like how long are we going to be doing this for? I have no idea. So I kind of started with like 6 weeks, and then the next one was 8 weeks. And then by September, we were like at 12 weeks. So I'm doing 12-week semesters, which I love. That's my favorite business model. But I do have a few people that either work shift work or couldn't practice in the evenings and the weekend slots that I had. And so I am teaching right now with another company, but they only run online classes. So I'm doing one drop-in right now and another one starting up soon with them. And I'm going to see how that goes. If they're, if they're popular, then I'll keep doing it. And if they're not, then I'll just go back to doing my own registered series. But so far they seem to be building pretty well. So most of my Zoom classes are all under my own umbrella. And then I have one right now. And by the end of February, I'll have 2 Zoom classes that are sort of a drop-in with under another company. And then some in-person stuff.
Yeah. It sounds like you have a lot of variation in your business, which is really awesome. And I'm happy to hear that you're able to do some in-person teaching and stuff like that. I think it's for those places that are allowed to reopen. I think it's a real joy and a privilege to be like back in person with students. I know we were able to open the studio that I work with in Alberta for a number of months. I think 3rd week of June until like mid-December, they had to close again due to the lockdown that's currently still happening in Alberta at the time of recording. And it was so nice. Like even with the restrictions and the smaller classes, just to be back, like breathing with other people, to have people in the space and that type of thing. And I think it's cool to be able to have this balance between like live stream classes, because people still really like those, teach in person, and then, like you said, be able to offer your own registered programs, which I love the idea of offering a registered program as opposed to just a drop-in. I think that's a fabulous idea.
Yeah, I think for me, it's always been pretty clear since I moved here that having diversity in my business model is really important. Because in the past, when I was in Calgary for the first 12 or 13 years that I taught, it was all just like live in-person classes. And eventually they were all self-run and they were long semesters. So I managed to kind of work out some of the things I didn't like about teaching only classes. But I think having my income be from diverse sources is really key, I think, to being able to have a business that thrives. So that if one thing kind of takes a hit, like it has the local stuff, with COVID, that you still have other things on the go. You're not kind of freaking out like so many of us have been with COVID hitting.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just in a podcast interview with another yoga teacher, and we were kind of reminiscing back to March of 2020, and just kind of this panic and just this flood of yoga teachers online, like live streaming on Facebook and Instagram and Facebook groups, and all these free classes and all these studios pivoting. And it's just like, I don't know, you just think back to it and it just feels like total chaos to think about it. And I mean, it's amazing that we pivoted. Truly, it's amazing. But I love that, like, now that we've been doing this for so long, that there's a little bit more fluidity and flow and kind of rhyme and reason to what we're offering as teachers and as studios as well.
Yeah, less panic and more sort of consciousness when it comes to like, okay, how do I, if I do decide to teach Zoom, teachers are asking themselves that question still, like, do I want to keep doing this? But for those of us that do, like, being very conscious and intentional with it. One thing that I have, it's interesting because I do really miss, of course, I miss my in-person classes, because there's something, like you said, about the community and about the all being in the same room. And I also know quicker if my jokes have landed because, they're not muted, which is always good too. But I also really love the Zoom classes because I have people in my classes right now that like could never go to a studio. So some of them are there because they're my former students and they get to practice with me again and they're excited about that. Some of them, like I have students in Germany, we would never get to study live together. I have moms that, or have like 3 kids at home. And so, yeah, they can come and do some yoga while the kids are in bed, but there's no way they could have gotten a sitter and then gotten to the studio and then drove back. And like, it just would have been so impossible for them to practice that it wouldn't have happened. And so I'm really glad to have the Zoom classes for those reasons as well. Also for the people like myself that tend to be very introverted, I've noticed that they are really thriving with the Zoom classes because they're in their own environments and they've got their jammies and their tea and they're just, kind of really comfortable. And at the same time, I also love the live classes. I wonder why it seems like that teachers feel like they have to choose one or the other. I often notice there's this dichotomy where it's like, it has to be this or it has to be that. I'm more of a yes and both girl.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. That's definitely, like, we've had lots of conversations from the studio perspective with the studios I work with about what the future looks like. And I mean, we've been doing like in person and live stream at the same time with classes. Some classes only live stream, some classes only in person. We, run workshops and registered programs this way. And I don't think we're ever going to completely get rid of the live stream. And it's been so awesome to be able to record them and then put them in a library. Like, there's just so many options. And like you said, it allows people who maybe couldn't come to the studio or couldn't come to class for whatever reason to be able to access yoga. And then also as teachers, it allows us to have a bigger reach than just our geographical confinements, which is pretty cool. And especially for somebody like yourself, where I'm sure you had lots of practitioners in Calgary that are like, oh, cool, I can practice with Nick again. Like, that's awesome.
Yeah. It's, and I would think even too with, because I know you're in Canmore, or one of the studios you work with is in Canmore. And, it must be great for people that maybe used to live in Canmore, but have moved away, to be able to like still practice with the teachers at the studio.
Yeah, absolutely. We've had a lot of people that are like, "Oh, cool. Like I, used to practice when I lived there, or I came through for a class and like love the studio and haven't been able to come back," who have purchased online memberships. And it's been really awesome to kind of expand their reach outside of just like the little mountain town. So,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, it's been really great. Hey everyone, we're just taking a quick break from the podcast to talk about OfferingTree. I wanted to remind you about the special discount you can get with OfferingTree. I love telling yoga teachers about OfferingTree because not only is it your one-stop shop for all things that you need in your yoga business, but it is also easy to use, it's affordable, and it's truly an amazing company to work with. OfferingTree lets you sell courses, run classes, manage memberships, and so much more with just one account. That's right, just one login for all those parts of your business. One of the best parts about OfferingTree is their online store. You can sell digital content like yoga videos, challenges, and courses right from your website. If you're teaching yoga classes and looking to level up, selling digital content is the next step to growing your business. Over the last year, we've seen so much pivot and change happen in the yoga industry, and having your own unique yoga business where you offer your students different course material can be so beneficial in creating a sustainable business with diversified income. And while there's many different platforms that you can create courses on these days, OfferingTree's course tools are easy to use and they're really affordable. And if you have a website you already like, you can still use OfferingTree. But there's one other thing I want to tell you about OfferingTree that makes all the difference in the world to me and probably to you too. They're a company that truly cares about yoga teachers and the wellness industry overall. I chose to partner with OfferingTree because I love the product and I love the people. Whenever yoga teachers have a suggestion for something that they need out of the platform, they can reach out directly to the people at OfferingTree and they're actually heard. So much of the development that OfferingTree has gone through over the last year has been because of yoga teachers like yourself. So if you're looking to save time, energy, and money in your yoga business, OfferingTree is hands down the software for you. Go to offeringtree.com/MBM to learn more and get your discount. Okay, let's get back to the episode. And one of the things that I think is really cool about your story and your background is that you're actually a yoga therapist. Can you talk a little bit about like why you decided to become a yoga therapist and what that kind of entails or what that means?
Mm-hmm. So I had been teaching probably so I was teaching what I would call therapeutic yoga even before I was a yoga therapist. I just probably wouldn't have called it that because it never occurred to me. But I was teaching for probably about 3 years when a colleague of mine was moving away and said, "Do you want to take my yoga for back pain class?" And when I had done my training, which was a really great training, my first 300-hour, there was mentorship and I had mentored for like a back pain class. And the students that were coming into that class, I mean, some of them were walking in still with their neck brace on. And it was very, people were still very injured. And so that's kind of this setting I had in my mind when she brought this up. And I was like, oh, like that's way too much responsibility. I don't want to deal with that. But then when she's like, no, these are regular people. The class was run at a gym. She's like, they're already coming to the gym. So like they're through sort of the initial healing process enough that they've been approved to go to the gym. So, it's like a regular class, except you're focusing specifically around back health. And I was like, oh, okay, well, maybe I could try that out. And I myself have had back pain my whole life. I have a little bit of a fusion on one side of my lumbar to my sacrum, which I only just found out about. I've always just felt a little crooked and not known why. And so, I can relate, obviously, to what they're going through. And so I started teaching that class and it got really, really popular. And then it ended up being another class and another class. So it just ended up being kind of a niche that I didn't intentionally seek out. And I just called them back pain yoga classes. And this was even before I took my yoga therapy. But the reason I decided to really dive into my yoga therapy studies is because at a certain point when you've been teaching for as long as I had, and you have such a voracious appetite for knowledge like I do, it's really hard to find places to learn more. Like if you've already got a 500 and you've been teaching for over 10 years or 12 years or whatever it is, and you want to learn more, it's like, it seemed to me like the only way to do that was to become a yoga therapist. And since I was already working with people with their back pain, it just seemed like such a logical fit for me. And then the other thing I would say is that I had also at one point been diagnosed with chronic fatigue, and I was still teaching full time. And so my practice really had to shift into just sitting with myself in the morning and saying, what do I need today? And sometimes that was just like, I need to roll on some balls to get some pain relief. I need to just do a few little things and then some yin. And so my kind of attachment to what like a yoga practice should look like really started to shift. And I started to look at it from my own perspective, but also with my students, more so like, how can I serve them best today, as opposed to like, oh, I have my lesson plan and I really wanted to do this dancing warrior sequence, and so that's what we're going to do. It really started to shift to, what are the needs of the people in front of me? And so this was all starting to happen, I think, as a primer. And then when I moved to Victoria, there's a fantastic yoga therapy program here through a studio called Ajna. I had considered doing it in Calgary, but unfortunately the options were either a program where I didn't resonate with the teacher that was International Yoga Therapist Association approved, or a program that wasn't International Yoga Therapist Association approved that had amazing teachers. But I was in that point where I was like, well, if I'm going to spend all this time and money, I don't know if that approval is going to matter. I don't know if having that stamp is going to matter. But I think if I'm going to spend all that time and money studying, I kind of think I should go with a program that's been approved and validated by them, just in case, And so there wasn't really an option for me to do it in Calgary. But when I moved to Victoria, there's a yoga therapy college out here, and called Ajna. And not only are they Yoga Therapist Association approved, but they were also registered as a university or a college. And so you can even go there and get student loans. So it was amazing. And so I signed up for that program. And from the moment I walked in the door in my very first intensive, I was like, I'm home. These are my people. This is like, it's just I don't know, there was something kind of like an inner resonance that was just like, yeah, this is it. And so I finished that program and I loved it. And I had, other yoga teachers say things like, you've been teaching as long as you have, and you had these areas of expertise. Like, are you even going to learn anything in yoga therapy? And of course, there was a good chunk that I did already know, because I am such a voracious learner. But there was also so much that like I didn't. And even just topics covered that like were not even a topic way back when I took my teacher training, like trauma sensitivity. That wasn't a thing when I took my first training. And the science, movement science and studies of yoga and meditation have all changed so much over the years that I've been teaching. So it was really great to be able to dive into a program and just learn in that kind of intense environment. Again, I don't mean intense in a bad way. I just mean like it's an immersion. It's really, and I did the program fairly quickly and straight through without taking a lot of time off. I just kind of went all the way through, and it's a fantastic program and I loved every minute of it. I often say, if I had the money and was willing to sacrifice my weekends again, I'd probably take the whole thing all over again, just because learning that much in kind of a really immersive environment, and then having that community there was just such a gift.
Yeah, that sounds incredible. And what's like the major difference between, I guess, an RYT and a yoga therapist?
All right, I have some notes prepared for you. So yoga therapists are a subgroup of yoga teachers who have committed to expanding their knowledge beyond the standard yoga teacher training. Yoga therapists have intensive specialized training to prepare them to be part of a healthcare team. And the function of yoga therapy is to use the teachings and practice of yoga in a therapeutic context in order to provide the tools and support of consistent yoga practice, in order to increase self-awareness and engage the client or student's energy towards their own health and well-being. So the intentions in yoga therapy include, but aren't limited to, reducing or managing the symptoms that cause suffering, improving function, helping prevent the occurrence or reoccurrence of illness or injury, and moving towards improved health and well-being. And yoga therapy also helps our students change their relationship and their identity or their identification with the condition. So it involves really specialized skill and training development, which supports the relationship between the therapist and the client. And we use both the principles of yoga practices, assessment skills, and we are familiar with the biomedical and psychological foundational knowledge. And yoga therapists work with our clients, and sometimes, individually, and sometimes in small groups with like a themed class. And in some cases, we collaborate with people's healthcare teams to create an empowered therapeutic, but customized plan specifically for their needs, with the intention of being prevention, health, and well-being of the client being the priority. So let's put that a little bit more kind of layman speak. When you start looking at yoga from a therapeutic lens, you're looking at sort of, first of all, the whole being of your students. And everything that you're putting, for example, into a sequence is very intentional and very functional. So when I'm creating a sequence, whether it's for a themed class or an individual, I'm never just putting in poses unless I can look at that pose and say, how is this helping them specifically with what they have going on? And if it's not in there. And so sometimes, yoga therapy sequences look quite different than they would in just an average yoga class, because there's less emphasis on, flow and kind of traditional sequencing, and more emphasis on the individuality needs of that group or that person. And so basically it shifted all of my sequencing, which had already shifted when I started working with back care people, because it was like, well, I only have, 75 minutes with these people. What's the priority to help them with their back? And so that means like chaturanga is not in the mix. That means warrior, kind of irrelevant. It's like which poses are going to help them strengthen where they need to strengthen, release what they need to release, and create awareness of the areas that they're still healing. And that becomes sort of the lamppost of the whole sequence. So some yoga therapists work really sort of in the mental emotional realm, and some are more in the physical realm, sort of, partnering with physiotherapists, and some do a little bit of both. And the great thing about yoga therapy is once you become a yoga therapist, you can be sort of a generalist, although I never recommend that with any. I'm a big fan of niching, so I never recommend that, but you can if you want to. Or you can find a really specific group or population that you want to work with. So for example, in my case, it was back care for years. I still work heavily with back care, but recently I've also added in anxiety. And that was because of something I knew as soon as I started taking my yoga therapy training, that I was going to start offering classes specific to anxiety, because turns out I didn't know this at the time, but I've had anxiety my whole life. And I didn't realize that until I moved here, because I have a form of high functioning anxiety. And so that didn't fit with the picture I had in my head about what anxiety was. So I didn't even know that I had anxiety until I moved here. And the more I took my training and the more I started learning about sort of the mental emotional model, and then like what yoga tools can support that, the more I really started getting this spidey sense that like, I'm definitely going to be working with people with anxiety at some point. But when I first finished the program, I just didn't feel ready. And I realized that like, we never really feel ready. Mm-hmm. But it was definitely a not ready. It wasn't like, me not feeling worthy and not ready. It was, I'm not through my own anxiety enough yet to hold space for others.
Right. Right.
And
there's a difference for sure.
Totally. There's a difference between like, oh, I'm just kind of timid and I don't have the confidence, and like, no, this is not wise, And so it wasn't wise initially at that point, because I needed to do some more work on my own anxiety. And, I had a team that was helping me everything from nutrition to herbal medication to counseling to, acupuncture. I was just pulling out all the stops. And until I kind of got through that initial sort of acute phase of anxiety and had started to heal a bit to the point where I felt like I could hold space for other people, I wasn't going to offer it. And then COVID hit and I was like, oh, now's the time. It just hit me. I was like, yeah, I'm ready. And now is the time, because even people that maybe didn't identify as people with anxiety are anxious now. So it's like, now's definitely the time. And so I started finally putting what the class, I call it yoga for anxious times. And I've just loved moving into that. So a lot of yoga therapists pick an area that they really feel called to serve. It could be cancer. It could be, pelvic floor. It could be, there's a million things that it could be, injury rehab. There's a whole bunch of, I have colleagues that work with people that have Alzheimer's or Parkinson's. So really you can highly specialize. And I think a yoga therapy training, and you still keep studying. It's not like you take your so a yoga therapy training is an additional 800 on top of what you already have. It's not like you take that and you're just done learning. You're constantly, updating yourself and learning new things, but it really does give you the tools to kind of be able to then branch out and specialize in an area that you want to and dive deeper into the study of that.
Yeah. Thanks for going through all of that, Nyk. And I think just hearing you talk about that, it sounds like it really it really gives you the skills to work with students and clients in a little bit more of a specialized way. And I think one thing that, maybe you can relate to from your early teaching days, and I can certainly relate to, is this, like, you get out of teacher training and you go get your first teaching gig and you're in this studio space, and all of a sudden you're not looking at like yoga teacher bodies. You're looking at like just bodies of everyday people, like people that sit all day, people who work, people who are overweight, people who are underweight, everything in between that. And it's kind of like really scary the first time you do it, because all of a sudden you start watching them move and you're like, whoa, these people don't move the same way people who practice yoga every day move, or how yoga teachers move. And then, they have pain and they have other stuff going on, and they kind of trust you to help with some of that. And I feel like for the average 200, 500-hour yoga teacher, like, we're really not trained to specialize with people in that way. And it sounds like with yoga therapy, you get, more than double the hours that a 500-hour yoga teacher would have, that can kind of help you learn a bit more about the body and the mind and how you can work with people on a deeper level in a more therapeutic sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know. I think the thing they don't tell you in teacher training is that, by the way, when you get out and teach people, half of them will be injured or have a medical condition or something. And you like you said, it's not like you just walk in and it's like yoga teacher bodies. And this, comes up all the time in Facebook groups with yoga teachers, where like new teachers are like, oh my God, what do I do for this? What do I do for that? It's like, you don't do anything. You refer them to a physiotherapist or a doctor or and even within yoga therapy, I want to be very clear. We are not diagnosing people ever. Mm-hmm. That is beyond our scope of practice. But what we can do is, once they have a diagnosis, we can work with their healthcare team to create a program that's going to help to support their healing and give them a home practice or a class that is suitable for them. And so that's where sort of our skills are really, really useful. And a lot of people will say, well, then why don't they just go to physio? And it's like, well, first of all, physio only helps for so long. Like, there's a point where like the physiotherapist's like, okay, we're done with you, move on. And secondly, physiotherapists don't have all the other tools that a yoga therapist has, which are the yoga tools, like breath and nervous system and meditation and mantra and mudra. And, they don't have all of those little sweet tools in their toolbox to help people. So they're really kind of, unless they've done, extra training, of course, they're really kind of working on a physical level. Whereas in yoga therapy, we're working on the physical level, but we're also working on the mental body, the emotional body, all of it together. So that's what makes it sort of a holistic practice, is that we're not just saying, oh, okay, you have a bulging disc, so do these exercises. We are doing that, of course. But on top of that, we're also working with like how is their a mental and emotional state around this pain? And, can we help them? Studying current pain science is something that yoga therapists would be doing to be able to help with sort of the mental, emotional aspects of pain.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Thank you for touching on that. And one of the things that I'm curious about that we kind of touched on just briefly is you talked about how like targeting sort of a certain demographic or a certain market is something that a lot of yoga therapists do. And I'm curious, like for you, how were you able to find your target market or your dream student? And, what are your tips for other people who might be trying to do that at this point?
I think for me, and this is just my own personal opinion, preface it with that, I don't feel like I could ever niche into something that I hadn't actually experienced. I feel like I need not only the skills, but I also need that empathy that comes from having been in their shoes, or I don't feel like I could be as effective in helping them. So, for example, for years I had well meaning clients say, "Oh, do you ever teach yoga for kids?" Because they love coming to my classes and they have kids and they think, "Oh, I could help their kids." And I'm like, hell no, I'm not teaching kids. That's not something that I should be doing. I don't even have children, or they would say, I mean, I've used to babysit, but that's not the same. Or they would say, they would say things like, "Oh, why don't you do prenatal or postnatal?" It's like, because I've never had a child and don't plan to. Like, personally, myself, I would feel kind of, I don't know if this is a PG podcast or not, but I would kind of feel, I'm trying to think of another word, maybe bleep it out. I would feel like an asshole
Mhm.
talking to pregnant women about what they're experiencing in their body in a class if I'd never actually experienced it. So for me, my niches have to come from my lived experience. So I've had back pain and neck pain my whole life. So that's a pretty easy one. I've also suffered from anxiety my whole life. So it's a very easy place for me to speak, not only from the position of a yoga therapist and with those tools, but also just as a human being who's been there. So that's always how I recommend when I work with people if they're really struggling with their niche. It's like, find your wounds. Like, what brought you to yoga? What did yoga help you with? What has been the biggest impact in your life that yoga has made? Start there. That's my thoughts on that.
Yeah, yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I can actually speak from the perspective of I got a prenatal teacher training when I was like kind of new, just because I was taking trainings just to kind of figure out what I liked and didn't like. And I haven't been pregnant personally. And I was teaching a couple classes. I just subbed for somebody. And I did tell her, like, hey, I haven't had a baby. Like, I am trained, but I haven't had a baby. And she's like, no worries. Like, you can still teach it and stuff. You don't have to have a baby to teach it. But I do feel like there's a point of it, like, it's not like I could connect with these women in like a, hey, what's your pregnancy experience like? Like when I was pregnant, I felt this, or like these are things that
Mm-hmm.
felt good in my body when I was pregnant. So sure, I was like equipped to teach the class, but I didn't continue like teaching past, these couple classes I subbed because I just felt similar to what you were saying, where like I can't really connect on a deep level with my students because I'm not teaching from the perspective of like my lived experience, which is the types of things I like to bring into my themes. Like I don't theme a class around things that like aren't true to me or anything like that. And I think most teachers can probably relate to that.
Yeah. And I think to me, that is the difference between being a yoga instructor and a yoga teacher, right? Like, you can take a training and you can instruct people through the information that you've learned in the training. But if it hasn't been your embodied experience, I don't think that you can say you're teaching, because so much of teaching comes from your own experience and your own practice. Of course, we have the courses we take and the books that we've read, and all of that's great. But if you haven't actually embodied it, you're just kind of parroting facts and information without having like a real lived experience. And that's just, I mean, for me, I can't imagine ever teaching something that I haven't really had as part of my life experience or practiced within a deep way.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I can definitely relate to that as well. And I'm curious if you can share with listeners and myself how you've integrated kind of your yoga therapy into your business. And I think you've mentioned it a little bit with the yoga for anxious times and the back pain and that type of thing. But are there any other ways you've integrated those teachings into your current business offerings?
I basically don't other than yin, because I'm a yin yoga teacher trainer, and yin is got a very soft spot in my heart. So that's kind of the only exception, that I do teach general yin yoga classes, although I call them therapeutic yin, because once you have that therapeutic lens over your eyes because you've studied it, you can't ever take the yoga therapy out of any class that you teach. Like it changes everything so much, that even classes that maybe aren't called therapeutic are going to end up being more therapeutic, because there's just, it's just who you are at that point. So I teach yin classes, and those aren't specific to any kind of particular condition. But other than that, I don't teach any classes that are general. I don't just teach general like hatha or flow, or every class that I teach is either back care or anxiety, with the exception of my yin classes. And the same with my website. I don't work a ton privately with people, but when I do, it's like they come to me because they have back pain and they're at the point where they've finished physio and they're looking for sort of the next logical step to help to support them in their healing. So for me, it's very, very, I'm very deliberate and intentional with my classes. Like I'm just not interested in teaching anything else at this point.
Yeah, for sure. That's really cool to hear. So it sounds like pretty much your whole business kind of revolves around the therapeutic aspect. And I think that that's great because your students know that that's what you offer and they can turn to you for those types of classes. And I think there's a real need for that. Like more and more doctors are recommending yoga to people who are suffering from disease and injury and, post surgery, which is amazing. That's like an amazing, I think, piece of progress for us here in the West. But at the same time, I think that if somebody who has, say a back injury or is recovering from a surgery goes into an all levels vinyasa flow class, I mean, that could be quite shocking to their system and it could be quite challenging. And if the teacher is not equipped with the skills, like they can't really offer them something that's going to be like healing for their bodies as opposed to harming. And I know, I'm a yoga teacher as well. Like we never intend to harm anyone in our classes, yet it's like we're just teaching from the perspective of what we have to offer in that class. And so it can be hard when we have people coming with injuries and that type of thing.
Yeah. And I think that this is something that more teachers, I think, should be, comfortable saying to people when they come in. Like, yeah, I mean, if a doctor just says, yeah, go to yoga, well, what kind of yoga? Like, I mean, for example, in vinyasa flow, there's a lot of sun salutations. So there's a lot of backward bending into forward bending without anything lateral or twisting in between. And a lot of times there's this cue of, like roll up vertebrae by vertebrae. Well, if somebody's got bulging discs, that is going to do a number on their back. And they could have gone from, I'm feeling really good, I've got these disc issues, but like I'm not in pain right now, to like one yoga class away from backtracking. And I don't think that that's the fault of the teacher, because if they don't have specialized training, how in the world are they going to know that? But I think what we should be doing as teachers who maybe aren't yoga therapists is that if somebody comes to you and says, oh, by the way, I have this, and this going on, if you don't know how to deal with it, you should probably tell them yoga could be super helpful for you, but I think you need therapeutic yoga, and maybe have, some business cards in your back pocket that you can kind of hand out to people. And I know studios might not like to hear that, because that might mean that students no longer coming to their class. But if the student themselves doesn't know how to modify just the average yoga class so that it doesn't harm their body, teacher doesn't know. We don't want to be people, have people that have kind of moved to a point in their healing journey backtracked because of something simple that is part of the sequencing of a whole bunch of classes. So yeah, I think it's important, and I think there are more and more people that are injured. I don't hesitate to do it. I had a lady to refer out. I had a lady once reach out to me because she knew another yoga teacher who wasn't a yoga therapist. That yoga teacher referred her to me just because she knew I was a yoga therapist. She didn't even know my specialties. And this woman had breast cancer, and she'd gone through all her treatment, but she was looking to kind of get back into her yoga practice. And she was also of an age demographic that is, much older than I am. And, I mean, technically I could have said, oh, sure, let's work together. And I could have pulled out all my notes on yoga for cancer from my therapy training. But why would I do that when I have a colleague who's in her same age bracket and had cancer and specializes in yoga for cancer? Like, to me, that's a no-brainer. I'm going to refer her to my colleague because that's where she's going to get the best care. And I think sometimes that's what needs to happen. If you're teaching just like a drop-in class and someone comes in and they're, just coming out of an injury, sometimes you just need to say, this class isn't for you. And here's where you could get some help.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think that we should really be doing that more and more. Like, if you can't help somebody, you need to be very clear that you can't help them. And having like a network of other yoga teachers and therapists and yoga therapists and physiotherapists in your network is really great so that you can refer to one another. And yeah, I think that that's like a huge takeaway that I hope people are listening to right now, and just remembering that it's okay not to know everything, and we're not expected to know everything. And it's mostly just our job to let people know when we don't know something.
Totally. There's been tons of things that my students have mentioned that I don't know. And I just tell them, I'm not familiar with that. Let me research it.
Yeah.
Or let me reach out to a colleague who might know more. And if it's not something I'm able to deal with, let me refer you to somebody. Nobody expects you to know everything. That would be insane.
Yeah, 100%. And so I want to touch on the private aspect of yoga therapy and get into the pros and cons of running a private practice, but I want to do that behind the scenes. So I think here is a good point to wrap up. Nyk, I really appreciate everything you've shared in this episode. Can you tell listeners where they can go to find you?
Yeah, you can just go to nykdanu.com. So nykdanu.com. And from there, I have a landing page that says, are you a student or a teacher? And I have a teacher's portal. So if anyone wants to check out, I do business mentorship, and I also teach yin yoga teacher training. So if they're interested in that, they can just click on there, and then they can join my email list to find out more. And as far as social media goes, I have a love-hate relationship with Facebook, so I don't really send anyone there. But I am on Instagram, and I love Instagram, and I'm just at Nyk Danu Yoga on Instagram.
Amazing. Thank you so much for this conversation today, Nyk. It's been really wonderful.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right, friends, I hope that you enjoyed this episode of the podcast with Nyk Danu. If you want to hear a little bit more about why Nyk has chosen not to focus her business on privates, we are actually diving into that on this week's episode of M.B.M Behind the Scenes. So you can get access to that at patreon.com/M.B.M Yoga. And when you sign up, you get access to every single episode we've recorded, which is almost a year's worth of episodes. So there is lots of good stuff there. And Nyk has some really awesome things to share when it comes to the topic around being a yoga therapist and running a private yoga business. Of course, I want to give a huge shout out to our sponsor for today's episode, OfferingTree. Thank you so much to OfferingTree for supporting the podcast. And to start spending more time with students and less time with software, head on over to OfferingTree.com/M.B.M to get an exclusive discount. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you next week. Bye for now. Thank you so much for tuning in for this episode of the podcast. To find links, notes, resources, and everything mentioned in today and all episodes of the show, you can head on over to mbomyoga.com. You can find the podcast and myself on Facebook and social media at Mastering the Business of Yoga. And I would love for you to join the private Facebook community, Yoga Business Badasses. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, please make sure you reach out to me at info@mbomyoga.com. And last of all, if you enjoyed this episode of the show, please make sure you hit subscribe and leave a review for the podcast. It would mean the world. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you next week. Namaste.